Dear Carol, dear friends, first of all, thank you for being here. Thank you for your support and for the innovative and stimulating works presented and discussed here. A warm thank you to Carol Mastrangelo Bove and the team at the University of Pittsburgh, to the donors who have made this gathering of Kristeva Circle possible, the fourth since the very first assembly in 2011 at Siena College of New York State University with Fanny Soderbach, followed by subsequent conferences hosted by the Universities of Vanderbilt with Kelly Oliver in 2014, Memphis 2015, and Stockholm 2016 with Karen Franzen and Cecilia Schochel. I cannot mention everybody of you, but thank you very much for being here. We gather today once again in the paradoxical situation I've often alluded to. It's through the English translation of my books that you know and follow my work. Yet, it is in French that I express myself best, though I will try to respond, perhaps clumsily in your idiom, which today is universal. Please excuse my insufficient English. It's easiest for me to read my talk. I trust you understand. Regarding this paradox, and in an attempt to shorten the distance between us, I have chosen not to give a conference in the strict sense of the word, but to present more casually a sort of conversation style, a series of answers to questions I suppose you might have regarding me, my writing, my work, and my engagement. This was also the intention behind my latest book called Je me voyage, published by Fayard in 2016, in which my life and my work intersect. It's not yet translated into English, but I'll give you a sort of sneak preview. The work in which I have been most absorbed these last few years is psychoanalysis, both in the clinical sense and as a lever for interpreting the new malaises of civilization. Hence, the title I have given to these reflections today, The Psychic Life, a Life in a Time. Je me voyage is an autobiographical text. This is the title of this autobiographical book. It's an autobiographical text in the form of interviews with a young French psychologist, Samuel Doc. The title's neologism, it's difficult to say in French, je me voyage, I travel myself. We say, je me jette, je me livre, je me révolte, etc. But we cannot say je me voyage. The idea is that I pass across my frontiers, interior and exterior. So it's a title, its title is a neologism. I wanted to put it on the first cover of my book because it gives a nod to my foreign status in the French language, which has largely determined my psychosexual positioning in research and in writing. This psychic experience, to be foreign to the used language, has been central to my life's trajectory, which I will not elaborate very long here. In my familial context, culture constituted a world that made life livable, and I experienced life, due to the importance according to language, as survival, as an intimate resistance and creativity inherent to social time. Freud's revolutionary theory of the unconscious and the transference-countertransference relationship proposes an overhaul of the dichotomies inherited from metaphysics, body and mind, animal and social, nature and culture, etc. This bold crossover, this bold reshaping of culture arouses fear, not only in relation to the social contract, which rejects it given that it's based on and structured by those realities, but also in relation to the bipartisan of our institutions and the foundational disciplines of the educational and cultural system. Psychoanalysts themselves, who practice and refine this reshaping, contribute to the perpetuation of this metaphysical inheritance when they isolate themselves, in many cases, from what is at stake in culture. I have called into question linguistic models constituted by and emerging out of the signifier-signifier structure and their grammatical and logical articulation. Was it my transgenerational history, my crossing of boundaries within and outside of myself, which led me to do this? It seemed to me important to shake up their grid, cut off as it is from the corporal experience. It was my clinical practice of transference, countertransference, and the influence of Klein and Winnicott, as well as Andre Green's work on the psychosomatic drives that motivated me to do so. I then developed an approach to literary creation and, in fact, to all discourses that stemmed from a language model conceived not as a structure but as a signifiance, a word that I borrowed from the Middle Ages modus significandi, the notions of grammar and logic in that past times in European culture. Signifiance is the word that was used in French or in Latin in the English translation also of my work. This is a process with two modalities, the semiotic and the symbolic. By semiotic, I am referring to the psyche constituted by language, its morphologics, syntax, logic, while the semiotic is pre- or trans-language, the infraverbal traces of instinctual drives, affects, and sensations which pregnate, transform, and sometimes absorb the verbal. You can find this, a lot of you know this work that I did in my book, The Revolution in Poetic Language. From the outset, I have addressed the zones of interference between nature and culture that I call la chair des mots, the flesh of words. Freud himself, evoking Greek mythology and the European Renaissance, from Leonardo da Vinci to Stefan Zweig, said that poets preceded us on the royal path to psychoanalysis. This wandering Jew, son of the Enlightenment, inherited from his Jewish tradition the invitation to listen, shema, in order to interpret. Convinced of the universal importance of his discovery, he was able to open it up to history and beyond the crisis of European culture to the human itself, to Homo sapiens understood as Homo religiosus. The primal horde, totem and taboo, Egypt and Moses, war and peace, civilization and its discontent followed. Beyond Sigmund Freud, the man, this intrinsically religious and political anchoring in cultural memory constitutes the very structure of the psychoanalytic position itself and, of course, of its discourse, both with and through the techniques Freud bequeathed. My efforts in the human sciences inscribes itself in this lineage, consciously or unconsciously, when I attempt to introduce Freudian interpretation into the theoretical models of today, to open them up to the confrontation with the unconscious and to open the unconscious to the confrontations in history and modern society. Yet, this concern to review and to renew psychoanalytic tools, to make them more relevant in the face of the new maladies of the soul, this is another title of one of my books, to tense traumatic situations, borderline conditions, and other unbindings, I'll refer ulteriorly to this notion, all these attempts also carry with them the danger to becoming overly involved in highly technical metapsychology, and to be by this way, but over technicization of our vocabulary, to be cut off from current social and anthropological mutations. How can we deal with this danger? In my mind and practice, psychoanalysis is a constant reinvention, attentive to its foundations and theory and history, on condition that it is continuously re-embodied in the subjectivity of the analyst, herself or himself, evolving in the counter-transferential relation with his patient. The Poetics of Interpretation bear witness on this alchemy. When I say the poetics of interpretation, I mean that in every psychoanalytic interpretation there is a poetic immanence, poetic underlying structures. Interpretation is a passion that is open both to self-analysis and to the time of history, into which the timelessness of the unconscious erupts. The framework of the cure, of course, is inscribed in historical movement, and if analysts forget this, they fail to address psychic life. The psychic life is always situated in time, the loss of the time and the involving time. In this sense, the question of culture, past, present, and to come, is consubstantial with psychic life, understood not as a device, but as a life whose finite nature is embedded in history. My personal trajectory, through its challenges, traumas, pleasures, failures, rewards, etc., has taught me this. I refer here to moments of enlightened understanding, rebounds and luck, or rather chances, as seen through the lens of game theory, not unlike objective chance in the dialectic history. And I try to sum up these experiences, this kind of time, temporality, or loss of time in my book, Je me voyage. In my familial constellation, my mother was very present, while at the same time leaving ample room for my father. Modest, warm, she studied biology and was a convinced Darwinian. My father, raised by his adoptive mother, was a believer, very literary and tender in the feminine sense of this drive. Everything was in place for psychic bisexuality to develop in me. There was another historical event in my childhood, as random as it was fortunate. This is the Alphabet Day, celebrated on May 24 in Bulgaria, the celebration of Slavic alphabet, which the brothers Cyril and Methodius invented 12 centuries ago. The culture and educational milieu went on parade. Everyone sported a letter, our incarnated words, names, sentences. I love this ritual linked to history, to culture, which celebrated a kind of transfusion of the person into writing. I was a letter, I was a sentence. Person is writing, writing is person. This was the sense of this parade. In another piece of luck, or rather chance, I discovered Freud and psychoanalysis. Confronting their current debasement, I emphasize in my lectures and writings that going into analysis is an internal experience, enabling a person to situate herself in the openness. This is, as you know, a concept very important in the work of Heidegger, the openness, l'ouvert. I explained to young psychoanalysts that I supervise that in the transmission of the analytical act, we are not working in the margin, but on the tangent between our knowledge and the vagaries of history, always opening the knowledge to history and history to knowledge. The technical framework of analysis is tangential to historical movement. It is, of course, necessary to maintain the counterphobic role of the framework and theory, given that they enable, in plural, connections to be made by reconstituting narcissism and the ideal ego in the cures working through process. But in the same time, it is indispensable to open the ear up to the adolescent experiences and to hear them here and now. Our works is not to meet the social demand, but to hear the social malaise, to be open, to be present in the social malaise. Today, civilization's malaise resides in the threat weighing on psychic space, on inner life. It is up to analysts to find a relevant and acceptable language to pave the way for subjectivation in the transference. But it is equally crucial for us to hear outside of our framework. This presents a double challenge because the analyst must show psychical flexibility while maintaining the technical rigor of the container. If she or he is fine-tuned to his or her accompaniment of the patient, she or he is able to detect new symptoms and generate new concepts. Yes, believe me, research does exist in psychoanalysis, though it is not sufficiently understood. We explore borderline conditions, the early motherhood relationship, even autism, and now radicalization. In order to position psychoanalysis in history and/or the actuality, there is also the matter of translating the technical side of our savoir-faire and provoking key elements of this inner experience we witness to other caregivers, psychotherapists, relaxation therapists, psychical therapists, etc., so that they can have a clearer grasp of the social malaise and thus help their patients who, although not in analysis, might find other ways of accessing in their other lives. Squeezed by acceleration of time and hyperconnection, the interior life becomes suspended in a stressed and stressful daily existence, dominated by media images which encapsulate and threaten to destroy our inner experience, l'expérience intérieure so dear to my research. How do we deal with this constant incitement to partake in spectacle, exhibitionism, narcissism, social media, selfies, and so on? This widely shared behaviors is a major social phenomenon that begs to be analyzed. In what ways is it both toxic and liberating in contact with the violence of trauma and desire? To problematize the present, to find an audible language, and to occupy a freely determined space, such are the challenges psychoanalysis must face. We have to maintain both poles firmly, new techniques and a double anchoring in both subjectivity in culture, inner time and social time. I'll reach here another topic that I'll call psychoanalysis as a translation of traumas and their trajectory. Allow me to be a little detour through Europe. It's a very fragile place for many reasons, and especially because 23 languages are spoken here. Translation is the European language. As a professor directing the thesis of foreign students and as a psychoanalyst working with patients whose mother tongue is not French, I have been observing a psychic renaissance expressed precisely in this polylingualism and the act of translating. Given that both analysts and analysant are socio-historical agents, interpreting the unconscious and the analysant, that is what he says and wears, constitute already a translation of traumas and desires. One bets on the translatability of traumas and thus on their trajectory they're working through. We bet on the fact that traumas and drives are translatable and thus their trajectory can pass through the working through process of psychoanalysis. Bringing this knowledge of the psyche to light on the social and cultural stage is not easy. It falls to each of us to make use of the rigorous tools of our respective fields to confront the social crisis, identity, the need to believe, populism, fundamentalism, and the new social agents, adolescents, different sexual orientations, and reproductive modalities. This is a question not so much of an engagement, I'm referring here to the Sartrean notion of engagement. I say that this psychoanalytic approach of the social is not, in my mind, a question of engagement, but what I call a co-presence, an opening, a presence, mutual presence, providing a neighboring framework of the cure in and through the socio-historical environment. One begins with the relevant interpretation in the framework, then its transmission, understood as a transition interpretation of historical change addressed to the social body itself and its movement. Another topic I would like to address in this series of questions that I suppose can ask me to my work, to my social existence, to my biography, and also to my writing, are what I call the anthropological changes we are crossing. I will mention three of them: the time, the sexual difference, and the religious experience. Never has humanity known an anthropological mutation as radical and widespread as the one we are experiencing today. Technology moves forward with a dizzying speed. Communication has never been so global, extraordinary in its diversity and heterogeneity. Our relation to time in this context is both hyper-accelerated and suspended. It becomes suspended in melancholy or in borderline conditions, and also in drug addiction and jihadism. It's a time of sacrifice, a maniacal narcissistic exaltation which literally explodes both the traumatizers and the traumatized. But it is also a suspension of jouissance, sacrifice but jouissance. Jouissance lived out as the drive-based avidity experienced by the consumers that we are. We can equally consider that suspension of time in a more abstract mathematical way, given that cosmologists today claim time doesn't exist in interstellar space, in the multiverse, as they say, or in other dark matters. There is no time, they say. Never has temporality been so paradoxical and yet accessible. But who has this access to these different facets of temporality, if not the analyst and his analytical process, where the dynamics of transference, repetition, and finitude inscribe themselves in a beginning, repetition, and infinity without end. This process, this analytical process, and the heterogeneous temporalities that we cross in it encompasses transgenerational clusters, as well as the reticular adaptation fantasies, but also flashes of sharp idealization, along with sacrificial hallucinatory holograms. Only analysts have access to all of the above temporalities expressed through singular experiences, and I will encourage researchers in psychoanalysis to analyze and go very deeply, better that I can do this today, in these different temporalities of sacrifice, jouissance, suspension and renewing that I mentioned through transgenerational clusters, reticular adaptation fantasies, flashes of sharp idealization, or sacrificial hallucinatory holograms. This is to say, by way of the extended rationality, aligned to analytic rationality, we are on the position, we analysts, on the position to propose new approaches to this heterogeneous temporality that humanity is invited to live today. Philosophers, ethnologists, and politicians simply don't operate on this level. In my last novel, The Enchanted Clock, published by Columbia Press in 2017, it's just been published, I try to sublimate in fiction these complex subjective temporalities. The second challenge that our time approaches is the reorienting of sexual difference. Psychic bisexuality is omnipresent, but articulated in different ways in history. It's omnipresent because it's structural for every human-speaking being. We are all bisexual, but it's articulated in different ways in history. I ended my essay on feminine genius, Hannah Arendt, Klein, and Colette, by affirming that there are more than two sexes, and that we invent our singular sex in our intimate life. The intimate life is the invention of the singular sex. This process is also the basis of every creative act. The end of an analysis opens up the capacity to make connections, to play, and, adopting Winnicott's words, to recreate one's psychosexuality continually, with or without a partner, with love or in the shadow of this fat love. I quote here the great Colette, La Grande Colette, whose connections to plants and animals enabled her to thrive. Or to invent love or outside love or crossing love in the caring professions like psychoanalysts, for instance. Although repression of sexuality also returns with galloping speed today, despite and alongside marriage, equality, and other praise for enjoyment without restraint, which goes back to what we used to say in the May 68 movement, jouir sans entrave. There is also the tendency to free sexuality from inhibition by restoring its creativity. And psychoanalysis participates in this movement, in this last movement, where sexuality reinvented in the inner space is the basis of creative process. Psychoanalysis participates in this last movement, which plumbs the depths of psychic and tri-psychic structures inaccessible to the sociologists, anthropologists, and philosophers. The third change after time, after bisexuality and its recompositions, the third change was that of the religious continent, the religious movements. The current global resurgence of religion came to me as a surprise. I consider myself one of the rare atheists remaining on earth. As a psychoanalyst, I observe the importance of what I call the need to believe, a universal and pre-religious anthropological need, which I examine through the lens of what Freud calls Katexis, Besetzung in German. The need to believe and the desire to know, never one without the other, are the universal conditions for human beings to be able to talk and relate to each other. Psychoanalysis is alone in its ability to leave the denial weighing upon the need to believe. It does so in order to take the measure of the sexual dimension in it, the sexual dimension in the need to believe, and to interpret it in the transferential-counter-transferation relationship without compromise. Now, Some words on the need to believe that I explored longly in different books, and I'll try to sketch here rapidly. One cannot be content to say that Freud reduces religion to an illusion and a source of neurosis, what religion is also and still. And that the analytic experience itself is not a strange to believe in the broad sense of the term. Steeped in the Jewish tradition, but atheist and conscious of the anthropological place of the religious, Freud is at the same time a child of the Enlightenment. You know this, but can you use this in order to invent anew his position in the resurgence of religious field today? According to Sartre, atheism is, I'm quoting, a cruel and long-term experience. In Moses and monotheism, Freud makes Moses an Egyptian. I interpret this as a cruel deconstruction of the origins of Judaism, making Egyptian monotheism its starting point. But one can also read this as an invitation to inscribe the Torah in the history of humanity. An intransigent atheist, Freud underlines in the resistance to psychoanalysis that, I'm quoting, nor is it perhaps entirely a matter of chance that the first advocate of psychoanalysis was a Jew. To proffer belief in this new theory called for a certain degree of readiness to accept a situation of solitary opposition, a situation which no one is more familiar than a Jew. Please notice here the need to believe in this reflection in which Freud seems to be stating part of a last will and testament. In the spirit of the Enlightenment, with Goethe and Diderot, Freud joins Nietzsche, who proclaims that it remains for us to place a big question mark at the most serious place. A big question mark at the most serious place. That is God precisely, but also identity, value, or system of meaning. The future of an illusion and Moses and monotheism invite us to pursue re-evaluating this religious cultural legacy, with which secularization cut the strings. Certain analysts have responded, for instance, Fethi Ben Slama with Islam, Daniel Siboni with Judaism. For my part, I have probed Catholic mysticism with Teresa Fabula texts revealing an extravagant and modern feminine figure in Teresa My Love, published by Columbia Press in 2016. Another topic in this conversation with you, reaching some questions I suppose you asked about my recent work, is the notion of adolescent and the psychoanalytic concept of unbinding. In my article of January 2016, entitled How Can One Be Jihadist, and that I published following the killing in France, Charlie Hebdo and the Bataclan, I raised the question as to how to stop the unbinding when adolescence, ideality, illness leads to nihilism. At the home of the adolescent, Maison de Solène, at Cochin Hospital in Paris, a co-ed and multicultural team of ethnopsychiatrists admits young people struggling with depression and solitary destructivity, which they cannot put words on or share with anyone. They are at risk for suicide attempts, anorexia, and radicalization. Those prone to radicalization repress the injury of exclusion, while appearing normal. They are ready to take off for jihad. Without judging or diagnosing, the team listens, aware to the need to understand and interpret exclusion wounds and religious memory. My seminar on the need to believe, first at the University of Paris 7, and for 5 years now with Professor Marie-Rose Moreau at this Maison de l'Adolescent, Home for Adolescents, flushed out harmful behavior, the faithful Muslim submitting to what some scholars call mass orthodoxy in Islam. I'm quoting here Abdennour Bidar, who is a philosopher from Muslim origin, who speaks about mass orthodoxy in Islam, which by ignoring the individual, by reducing women to prey, spreads a culture of that throughout radical Islam, repressing the individual and emphasizing the mass orthodoxy, stressing on the how to do and not why. Everything is reduced to procedures and ritual and deconsidering questioning and individual development. That's what they called mass orthodoxy. The intense desire to transcend oneself, so common to adolescents with their frustration, can, in certain circumstances, to be perverted into radical evil. This is a Kantian notion to which I'll come back later. By listening to those adolescents, we can help adolescents in the grips of an identity illness to succeed in finding flesh in word, trouver la chair des mots, and to think on their own in an intercultural space to regain confidence and become invested in the desire to live. I'm not setting up an opposition between the analytical cure and the therapeutic practices of social workers. I'm putting them side by side, of course. To speak of our foundings in psychoanalysis practice to the larger public requires a discursive flexibility that takes into account the listener's ability to understand. How do you do this at the Maison d'Adolescents? The container is provided by the interstructural, intercultural, ethnopsychiatric team I referred already, while I offer a seminar open to the caregiving staff who have the desire and curiosity to know the religious facts, to engage with the texts and interpretations they arouse, especially those based on clinical psychoanalysis. Some words about the radical evil and how to deal with it in the secular society. Enlightenment's secularization refashioned morality, which until then was dominated by religion. For Kant, we forgot very often that free will itself has a shadow side. It becomes corrupted, losing the sense of the moral distinction between good and evil. And this is what he calls the radical evil, which Hannah Arendt diagnoses in analyzing totalitarianism and Holocaust, when certain human beings declare others superfluous. Pogroms, religious wars, ethnic conflicts, colonialism, amok, and Holocaust follow. We are touching on not only threats to freedom, but also on what I call the malignity of the psychic apparatus. Destructivity, given free rein to the death instinct, hallucinatory states, the move to savage acts, decapitations, and kamikazes. In short, all these phenomena are inherent dimension of human psyche. This malignity may be to different degrees sublimated, worked through or bound in neurotic structures, explosive borderline conditions, and as-if personalities. When they involve the psyche of the adolescents, for instance, we call these breakdowns bindings, unbindings, or des liaisons in French. Religions, which in the past and in the best cases utilized and ritualized these states of unbinding, are now incapable of dealing with them, whereas the secular state needs more firmness and more subtlety, but they need this, their lack of the firmness and of subtlety, and their de-radicalization centers are virtually powerless. At the Collège of Bernardin, with a panel of religious and non-religious intellectuals, we created a Montesquieu circle to discuss our experiences and convictions regarding recent world events. In this setting, I have spoken about my perspective on adolescence and binding and the work we do at Cochin. Such borderline cases dominated by negativity don't share female psychosexuality too. Some women cover themselves in burkinis, others are ready to procreate for Allah, not for men, not for society, they say, but for Allah, or indeed become human beings themselves. Our research on hysteria straddling psychosis, perversions, and false selves, among other symptoms with the women too, has not entered into social arena, unfortunately, which remains unaware or refuses to discuss it, but we can utilize them, all those devices and clinical approaches, and we have some successes with it, with women also in this Hôpital Cochin and Maison des Adolescents. In a text wrote some year ago, I propose to conceptualize adolescence not only as an age, but also in an adolescent structure, a notion that was outlined by Helen Deutsch. Adolescent structure is a fragile structure, a revision of the Oedipal structure, and entrenched in puberty drives. You shall find this in my text called Les secrets d'une analyste in the Maladies of the Soul. This adolescent structure persists in adults in this sense. When the belief in the absolute, the quest for an ideal fails, this adolescent structure reverses itself in a destructive force against the self with the other, and this is the unbinding. No link to any object survives for these subjects who are not objects, ni subjects, only the death drive triumphs. This is what Andre Green develops very patiently in his work on unbinding. That's what I am trying to develop in my work with adolescents. Better than other approaches of the religious sort, the secular perspective in which psychoanalysis takes its place is able to assure the passage from the need to believe to the desire to know, provided it has access to the proper means and tools. Our priority is, in the secular society, the education combined with a substantial increase in the status of a teaching and training course. This arrangement would provide individualized support for psychosexual malaise, from the need to believe to the desire to know, in order to create a true path forward above the deepening abyss and the threat of war. Media, culture, and politics should be offering new and attractive civic ideas. Indeed, this should be top priority of our hyper-connected globalized world. This alone, through shared cultural diversity, can protect humanity. And I cannot envisage this project that I defend quite often to the arena of UNESCO without a greatest participation of psychoanalysis in this field. Let me reach now, and approaching the end of my communication, my notion of object and objection connected with this notion of unbinding, adolescent structure failing, and the need to cross education with psychoanalysis in order to respond to the malaise of civilization. In the case of the adolescent, the desire to know goes hand in hand with the need to believe. This adolescent desire to invest the primal sin of the parents, a sexual curiosity and fulfillment, is demonstrated in the affirmation of homoeroticism in the adolescence and the discovery of genitality also in adolescence. Here, too, religions exercise their domination. At the same time, the undergoing changes of parenthood today all too often exposes adolescents to severe psychic solitude, despite or rather because of the normalization of hyperconnected information. I developed this quite longly in a study called Metamorphosis of Parentality from 1913. Unbinding also resonates with the genesis of my notion of objection in my practice. This is a notion that you know better because it's already translated into English. I explored it early as early as 1980 in Powers of Horror, an essay on objection, and at the time of the Louvre exhibit called The Severed Head, published in English under the title Capital Vision, Vision Capitale from 1998. In this context, I wrote that, I'm quoting, "The image may be the only link with the sacred remaining to us, with the horror provoked by death and sacrifice, with the serenity flowing from the pact of identification between sacrificed and sacrifier, and with, essentially, the joy of representation which cannot be dissociated from sacrifice, its only possible trajectory." Here I insisted on the necessity to give a representation to unbinding and objection through images, through writings, but also to language and interpretation in the framework of transference and countertransference. Objection takes its place in the same context. Objection, or the object, is what is neither subject nor object, but increasingly returns, disgusts, rejects, fascinates. It is near but not able to be assimilated. Different from the uncanny of Freud, objection is elaborated through a failure to recognize its kin. But there are many manners and degrees of unbinding and objection. Let me stress another very particular, which interests feminine sexuality too. A very conflictual relationship with the primary maternal figure often precedes unbinding of adolescent structure. Submission, a swallowing up by maternal domination, a reduction of the subject to a hallucinatory state, desiring avid satisfactions on the border of psychosis and delirium. There may be maternal domination and submission, which is on the other time and the same time rejected, fled, and also sought after, in order to be recovered once again in an all-powerful tyranny that is posted as divine, irrevocable, and unquestionable. What some call the mass orthodoxy, as I quoted previously, of fundamentalist Islam, finds its archaic cornerstone in unbinding and in objection. I was listening to a desperate mother who lamented, I was so close to my daughter. She told me everything. We were on the phone 45/7, and all of a sudden she disappeared. She left to have 1,000 children for jihadists. Is this not a flagrant example of objection? The young girl and her mother, too, have been invaded, cannibalized, without realizing it. The daughter cannot stand this blurring of subject and object, which make her abject. She believes she is saving herself by giving herself over the mother to abusive males, who reduce her to a sacrificial motherhood that is imperative, absolute, and without doubt, victimizing by Allah. She will thus be every bit or as devoid of subjectivity as before with mother. She still remains abject, be it with her mother or with the divine. The objection that is the Bataclan tragedy, what I saw in this example, derives from the gangster fundamentalism of our ghettoized suburbs. This delinquency, prime to radicalization, so common in prisons, reveals that the religious treatment of adolescent revolt has discredited itself too. These young people don't adhere to the classical religions. They don't adhere to the cultural values and republican ideals of our country either. Suffering from lack of identity and social marginalization, troubled youth might first embrace a native identity and subsequently turn to form of extremism. They are struggling with affective crisis out of our reach, with no recourse to questioning made available through language and thought. Torn in pieces of unbinding, they can no longer distinguish between good and evil. Such state of abidement destroys the possibility of gaining sense of itself and of the existence of others. The avidity for absolute satisfaction then takes shape of the destruction of everything that is not dissatisfaction, annihilating the boundary between self and other, interior and exterior, me, you, him, me, you. There are no boundaries between anymore. Everything is unbounded, no differences, no boundaries between good and evil, identity of me and identity of the other. Murder and sacrifice become blurred as they did at the Bataclan. I'll finish with a sort of personal anecdote that will explain to you how the personal and the cultural participate to the creation of some theoretical clusters and concepts. My text on objection came to me in the course of my analysis and through my scholarly writing. I was in the process of preparing a book on Céline, Powers of Horror. It was hard to get a handle on the abyss opening up between my revolt against his anti-Semitic violence, from the one hand, and the emotion which his fiction aroused in me. His novels, from Voyage to the End of the Night to Castle, were for me a veritable opera of the deluge, opéra du déluge, écrit Céline. Borderline states, idiocy, brothel speak, or well swept up in a prose as precise and classical as it is vernacular, musical, and vulgar. Sentences persist in the ellipses, flooded by sensation, affect, and drives both horrible and sublime. But how to name this power of horror? My mother was visiting France. She took care of David, who was teething and not sleeping at night, and for that matter, neither was I. I see it, it was still present in my mind. I am on Ilse Berande's couch. Ilse Berande is my psychoanalyst. And I say to her, I don't know how to manage all of it. The baby, my mother, and this Céline with his voyage to the end of the night, tu parles, all massacre, horror, objection. And my analyst responds, that is the word for it. I leave the session relieved with a feeling of deliverance more than the certainty of mastering my subject or mastering my book and so on. It's the mother-child confusion, attraction, repulsion, the uncertainty of subjectivation and objectivation I was speaking to you through unbinding adolescence and objection, which is the notion that I propose to you. Sublimating or working through, clearly both. Mary Douglas, the ethnologist, who inspired also my work, studied soiling purification rites in so-called primitive society. So I took the word objection that I pronounced on the couch, but that my analyst emphasized, that is the word for it, she said. I took the word and tried to elucidate food taboos in Leviticus, Christian sins, and even Céline. My psychoanalyst, Ilse Berhande, deserves to be better known. You don't know her, and you are not alone. Her writing on primary avidity, perversion, what she called merversion, to oppose or to add to merversion, perversion, perversion. Merversion is difficult to translate in English, but it posits the object of the mother as a primary object and underlying the process of unbinding and objection. But also she wrote an interesting book called Le Paternel Singulier, the singular maternal. All those notions and writings should be reprinted and translated. My analyst was a German Jew living in France and French-speaking, understood very well the word objection. Yet neither of us spoke French as our native language. Analysis takes shape in the lived experience of transference, countertransference. That's what I try to show you through this example. If and only if it opens us to a way of life and thinking that is increasingly personal, attuned to the senses, and shareable with somebody with whom we are in transference, in a sort of love affair. This was to lead me to reinvent psychoanalytic notions, but also to write novels. Those are my means to reach the social time and maybe your individual time too. Thank you again for your interest in my work and the experiences that have informed it. I've tried to share this with you today in a more personal way without forgetting what we are do more abstractly, more theoretically, more universally in our academic and social framework. Most of all, thank you for the papers you have presented and will present ulteriorly in other forums. I'm looking forward to the pleasure of reading them. Thank you again. See you soon again. See you soon again. Maybe in Paris.